Hello, my name is Michael Freeston. I'm Director of Quality Improvement at the Preschool Learning Alliance, and you're joining us today for a recording of the Supporting Children's Speech, Language and Communication Development in Early Years provision. I'm joined today by Isobel Wratislaw, highly specialist speech and language therapist.
Hello.
And by Sian Ansell, ABSS specialist teacher early years.
Hello.
The focus of our session today is to present the first in a series of webinars to be held on a quarterly basis over the next 18 months, kindly supported by the DFE under their Voluntary Community and Social Skills Grant Round 2018 to 2020. Please note the typo. There are a range of webinars that we will deliver, all focusing on the area of children's speech, language, communication needs in the early years, the essential importance of this for preparing children for later formal schooling. We're pleased to have the support of the DFE. Today's session is an introductory overview, looking at various topics introducing the subject, and also to remind ourselves of the central importance of supporting children's early language communication and development. So without further ado, I shall hand over to Sian to give us an overview of this aims of the session.
Okay, so as you can see, that today's webinar, we're hoping to ensure that we have a broad overview of speech, language and communication. So our first aim really for our session is to raise awareness of a vital role that communication and language plays in children's development. We specifically would like to explore what we mean by the term speech, language and communication. We're hoping that the suggestions we make and the exploration that we're going to have, we're going to be able to develop knowledge of the building blocks and components of language and the language pyramid, and consider ways in which we can, as practitioners, support our
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Your settings, whether that be within the home, if you're a childminder, or in our day nurseries and preschools.
Thank you. Moving on to Isobel, please.
Okay, so speech, language and communication are foundation skills for all aspects of learning, and they also impact on the social and emotional development of our children. And we have a number of statistics that I'm going to give you now that will back this up from research that's been done. So in the EYFS, it specifically says that SLC underpins all areas of the EYFS. They are interlinked. And children who are behind in language development at age 5 are 6 times less likely to reach the expected standard in English at age 11, and 11 times less likely to achieve the expected level in maths. So clearly the years up to the age of 5 are paramount in developing speech, language and communication. When they arrive at school, children who are in a stronger position in terms of their communication abilities find it easier to learn, while those already behind face a growing challenge. Early advantage accumulates, but so too does early disadvantage. Again, more evidence that actually the first 5 years is so important. And again, language development at the age of 2 years, understanding and use of vocabulary and use of 2 or 3 word sentences strongly predicts children's performance on entry to primary school.
From the age of 2? From
the age of 2, so as early as that. So those of you with children in nurseries, even if the children come to you as babies, that's absolutely prime time to be working with them in terms of their communication skills. As far as behaviour is concerned, we know that 2/3 of 7 to 14-year-olds with serious behaviour problems have language impairment. And 40% of 7 to 14-year-olds who are referred to child psychiatric services had a language impairment that had never been suspected before.
Never been suspected, not identified.
No, never been suspected. They'd managed to get through, probably by being fairly quiet and sitting in a corner.
I was going to say, that takes a considerable skill set to be able to go identify.
These are the opposite children to the ones with behaviour difficulties, so it's sort of the other end of the spectrum, so to speak. Disadvantage cycle, so children from low-income families lag behind high-income counterparts by 16 months in vocabulary at 3 years of age. So they're already at 3, so that's the age that some of you are receiving them in at preschool. They're already, could be, 16 months behind their peers.
At the age of 3?
At the age of 3.
So that's a third of their life, almost. More than their life, yes. Thank you.
And then with criminality, we know that 65% of young people in youth offender institutions have communication difficulties. That was a large piece of research that was done with people, with young men, I think, that were in the young offender institutions, and they did a whole battery of language assessments, and they found that 65% of these people were lacking the language skills that they needed. And then employability, ultimately, we all hopefully need a job. 47% of employers say they can't get recruits with the communication skills they need. So it's quite evident that actually...
Not so much on that last one about the employability, but with the other, does the research identify whether we are talking about considerable communication and language delay, or what might be considered mild?
I think it's the whole range. Probably.
Across the entire range?
The range.
Wow.
I mean, it's linked with the behaviour one. So if it's the same principle, that if you haven't got the language skills to express how you feel, you haven't got the vocabulary, or you haven't got that ability, then you're going to express yourself some other way.
But that's interesting. My point, and the importance for this for early years practitioners, is we're not talking necessarily always about children who need referral to specialist speech and language therapists. We are talking about children within a range who will be presenting in early years settings, and therefore the support that can be provided to them by early years practitioners may well be the help that they need to get to an effective level.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of children who, if you just listen to them, they're talking, so you imagine that their language skills are actually on a par with their peers. But if you then assess them, you might well find that they haven't got the vocabulary there. So they might be using words like thing, or doing, going, and they aren't actually, it's not rich in vocabulary.
I think we'll come on to screening and how to identify those sorts of concerns as we go through today.
I suppose it highlights the importance of our role as adults with the youngest children, that we maximise every interaction that we have, so that our youngest children are always surrounded in that rich language environment.
Thank you. Sean.
Okay, so I think really this is just an opportunity for us to be really clear about what we understand speech, language and communication to mean.
They are usually all read interchangeably.
Yes, they are, absolutely. But I think if we know as a team of people working with a group of children that we are clear about our understanding of the terms, when we're talking to our parents and carers, we can be really clear and help them in better understanding their children's development. Okay, so by speech, we mean the speech sounds that children use to build upwards, saying the sounds accurately and in the right places. But we mustn't forget how important the other hidden part is, which is speaking fluently, without hesitation, and using expression, using pitch and volume and intonation to support and emphasise the sounds and then the meaning of the words that they're saying. Okay, and by language, we mean that we're including both arms, the receptive language or understanding of the spoken language, and then talking, actually expressing ourselves. I suppose if you think about it, the understanding is understanding words and then how they're put together in the sentences,
right,
and making sense of that sentence. And by talking, it's how we then maybe use words to describe the objects and actions that is happening around us,
right,
and how we can then put those sentences into a conversation.
So do you mean in terms of the famous situation of children, I goed to school, as opposed to I went? It's a perfectly logical construction.
Absolutely.
From the child's logical mind,
Yeah.
but actually grammatically it's not, and vocabulary-wise it's not correct.
And if you're having that conversation with the child, and the child kind of, you can sometimes see them, they might say, I went there,
Yeah.
and then they'll shake their head and go, oh no, I went.
Right.
That's what we might call a repairing conversation, isn't it? So that means actually we don't need to really worry too much about that little one. They're hearing that grammatical mismatch and they're correcting it.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah, they're just applying
Yeah.
the regular rules to a word,
Yeah.
and it's another stage of development that they then move on to understanding that there are irregular
Yeah.
forms of
And it's kind of magical as a person working with young children when that happens, because you're part of that learning process. And then communication, in the sense that's the urge, the motivation to want to share or express a thought or an idea. And that can be verbally or non-verbal. And there's a very famous poem by the father of Reggio Emilia, and he talks about the 100 languages of children.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay?
So, we know that communication is made up of a number of different skills, and children have to develop all of these skills to be successful communicators. And we can demonstrate them as sort of building blocks which relate together and underpin communication. So one way we have of demonstrating this is by using what's called a language pyramid. So this isn't a model of typical language development, so we have to be very careful. It's very useful in illustrating how the different elements relate to one another, but it shouldn't be viewed that each component part must be developed and secure before the next element starts. So you wouldn't expect looking and listening to be achieved before children start to play.
So we're not talking about Maslow's hierarchy.
No, absolutely. So we know that looking and listening, for example, develops alongside speech sounds. They're not sort of at the beginning and end of language development as the pyramid would show. However, the model does help us to understand some basic principles, such as the fact that with typical language development, a child will understand elements of language before they're able to use them. And there's often a 6-month gap between understanding a word excuse me, and being able to say that word. So you may say to me, show me the cup, and I can correctly identify that, but I'm not able at that stage to say the word cup. It takes about 6 months for me to be able to work out the elements of that word, how to put them across.
Are there, a genuine question here, are there levels by which do children identify subject, object, verbs, nouns in different levels of, as would be able to say, show me, but not the noun of cup? Do they develop pieces of language and types of words before there are certain ones that come before others? I haven't explained that very well. Would they be able to say, there is the, and they can't think what the noun is, but they've got the there is?
No, they'd go for the noun first.
They would go, so it just becomes the pigeon set, nouns first.
Yeah.
Right.
If you think about that typical development, kids may be following baby's gaze and then they'll point,
Right.
and then usually the adult will then hang a name on whatever they're pointing at.
So it becomes the identifier, the signifier and the signifier.
Yeah.
So in our settings, we must think very carefully about all the building blocks of language development in relation to each child. So try not to make assumptions. That's the big lesson, really. Use your observations to guide your provision. Check with each child that each of the building blocks are developing alongside each other. And you can see from the diagram that adult-child interaction plays a vital role in developing each of those building blocks. as the children won't naturally develop those skills unless they're supported to do so. So we are going to be covering the whole of adult-child interaction within the setting and the home environment in more detail in future webinars, so I won't say too much about that now.
Can I ask about peer-to-peer language and communication? Children of the same age, the value of that in terms of language accrual and language development, as opposed to obviously socialisation and all those other benefits. Do children learn from each other, or would that just be a cycle of not improving if there were not the adult interaction?
It plays a part,
All right.
I say, in the sense that if I'm being introduced to something that we're playing with, and I can see that you clearly have got some binoculars, say,
right,
and I've never seen binoculars before, have no idea what it is. Later, when I'm seeing maybe binoculars elsewhere, I might think, now Michael had those,
right,
and they were binoculars, and I can make that link because I've got that connection because I'm interested in you. So we can share and learn some vocabulary of other children, given that they may show that they like something and I might not have met that word or that experience before. But it's still
to lead them on the journey. It has to be.
So don't forget, you've got play development as well. So if you're a solitary player, then you're not going to be taken on board with somebody next to you saying.
That's really helpful.
That's
Thank you.
really important, isn't it? Because that link between play and
Absolutely.
Thank you.
That will come up. So we're going to share some practical ideas, taking each of the blocks from the language pyramid in turn. But please be aware that the activities aren't always appropriate for all children, depending on their age and stage. So think about your cohorts of children and consider their individual needs. And then you've got publications such as the EYFS Development Matters for further guidance, and there are plenty of others in the resource.
I have a technical problem with my slides moving on. Please bear with me, colleagues. I have a redirect notice. What on earth does that mean?
Can you leave the room?
Phew, we're back. There we go. Sorry. On we go.
Okay. So, some of the ideas that have worked and been shared by practitioners that we've been supporting. One of the most impactful has been around matching sounds to objects. It can be animals, so you can hear a range of animal sounds and then match them to the pictures or the farm animal toys. Or, on a more personal level, is matching the name said by a child to the picture of that child. And there's some wonderful resources out there at the moment, like talking postcards and little talking tins. So very young children can record their own voice saying hello, and then another child can come and listen to that voice and then put the name to the face, or the voice to the name. That makes sense. Don't forget, body percussion is really important.
Body percussion, can you explain?
Well, that can be a variety of things. That's thrown me a little bit, Michael, sorry. It's more to do with enabling children to become aware of the different ways that they can use their bodies to make sounds, and then also copy and mirror and mimic
And
sounds.
create a rhythm.
Absolutely.
And create
And then also, if that's then supported by going on an environmental sound walk, you're just helping children to be able to differentiate between different ways of listening.
And making associations.
Yeah,
Thank you.
absolutely. Don't forget, as Isobel mentioned earlier, that some of the practical ideas that really help and encourage children's listening skills may also not necessarily be suitable for those children with specific complex needs. Have you got anything you'd like to add to that?
You're going to talk about that.
Okay. The reference to See Activity 1 in the resource pack, we are producing a resource pack to support this webinar, and that will be made available to those who registered for today's session.
And I think as we move on to the next slide,
And it did work this time.
Yay! It was hopeful thinking. It always works. I suppose, just like we are in this room, we've chosen a time when it's not going to be busy, when we're not necessarily going to be disturbed. And I think we have to give that sort of consideration to our learning environment when we're with our children. Are we making sure that we've avoided busy times, that we're working in a little group, or that we've reduced the distractions around children, particularly as we might tend to be doing these listening activities with those children who are the most difficult to show some attention.
Right.
So do bear that in mind, okay? And don't forget, letters and sounds are a fantastic resource, often quite forgotten about, but phase 1 in particular, the aspects 1 to 6, they all support listening and attention. We've also got the Babbling Babies and Talking with Toddlers resource packs from ICANN. There are many, many different resources out there to support us as we think about ways of supporting children's attention and listening. Thank you.
Okay.
So, play. When children are playing, they're showing their interest in the world that's around them, and if they then hear language linked to the objects that they're playing with and their actions, the language has meaning and becomes instantly memorable, like the binoculars scenario.
Yes. You're thinking on your feet there.
It was, yeah. But actually, we were fortunate enough a couple of weeks ago to attend the Talk to Your Baby conference. And at that conference, Lucy was sharing their research around early language and babies' acquisition of language. And what they discovered was that not only is it important that when we follow a point and we name that object, the quality of language was way better when children actually passed an object to an adult. There was more opportunity for a longer response. And
so in terms of it being physically a tangible thing in their hands, rather than being something that is drawn attention to. That's interesting.
Yeah, and it meant that the interaction were longer, the back and forth about what it was that the baby had passed them. So it's not to say that following a baby's point and talking about what that baby's pointing at isn't important, but the actual engagement has got...
It's sustained for longer. A richer
really
environment.
Meaningful. So for those of you working with our youngest children in the baby rooms, please, it's always have consideration. As you're handed an object, how can I maximise that? Right. Don't just go, tar.
No. Thank you.
And it's all about making sure that the child is leading with play, and it's not adult directed. I know we know it, but actually there's 1,000 reasons, language communication reasons, why we shouldn't be leading ourselves on that. It's important to know the children and find out what the child likes to play with. As Sean said, there's more language as a result. If it's something the child likes and they're already playing with, it's like us. If we're forced to do something, we're less likely to tell others about it, or we'll just grumble for a couple of minutes, but we won't actually be enthusiastic and want to tell everybody about something that we've done. And it's the same with children. Follow their lead. I'm sure many of you ask parents to fill in examples of the child's preferences for play when registering the child or when you first meet them. Now this applies particularly to typically developing children, but it isn't the case with children who are undergoing a diagnosis of ASD or autism. So with these children, it's important to use those preferences as a reward, not to be sucked into allowing those children just to be completely self-absorbed the whole time. We need to be interrupting their play.
Oh, right, that's interesting.
So if you use things like a first and then board, the first is, or now and then sometimes it's called, the first is the thing that the adult wants the child to do, the then is the reward.
I see.
Okay, right. And it can be stepped up, it can be a nanosecond of first thing, and then the then can be as long
But the
as
association has to be made in the...
so you're interrupting. You have to interrupt when it's an adult lead if it's a child on the spectrum, but you don't do that with typically developing children.
And we, in a subsequent session in this round, we are looking at the particular language support development needs of children with additional needs as well.
Yes,
so we will go into more detail of that later in the series.
Yeah. And don't forget that parallel or mirror play is sometimes a way into unlocking a child's language. So if you've got a particularly shy child, like we talked about earlier, this may help to encourage them to vocalise. So they may, if you just sit down next to them and mirror their play, they're more likely to turn to you and initiate a conversation than if you sit down and start bombarding them with questions. What are you doing? What have you got there? What are you playing with? What colour is it? How big is it? Etc. Yeah.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so as we kind of alluded to earlier, children need to hear words in many different contexts and over repeatedly in order to understand them and then to move on to use them. As Isobel mentioned before, typically it can take up to at least 6 months before I've clearly shown that I'm understanding by reaching for that object named, before I'll actually go, ka, or whatever. So
that must be can potentially be quite frustrating for parents. Absolutely. In that sense. If you don't have that understanding of that very long period from a child's life perspective, that could be quite frustrating unless they actually have that understanding.
Yeah, and sometimes it can cause a lot of anxiety for some parents because they might start to think, oh gosh,
there is a problem.
He's showing me the understanding, but he's not talking, there's a problem, when actually it's just part of typical development.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, so again, we've given some practical examples of ways that we can support young children's development of their understanding of language. Regarding the top bullet point here, obviously something so routine as nappy changing, for example, can often be overlooked as a bit of a chore as part of our working practice. And actually, it's one of the richest times to establish some lovely anticipatory language with young babies, so they start to, if you start talking to them about what's going to happen, they start to be able to show us that they're beginning to anticipate and link that language. There was a study done where they compared the time taken that dads took to change babies' nappies.
I get the sense you're not going to come out of this very well.
Oh my God, you're not. Because what happened was, typically, it was about 40 seconds, really quick.
It's just efficiency.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas the mothers and the female caregivers were taking much longer. And so there was the beginnings of a kind of chain of thought that actually nappy chatter matters. Right. That it's not task orientated, but actually it's a valuable experience. So
point taken, thank you.
Okay, value that. Again, thinking about us as professionals working with young children, with children's understanding, we mustn't forget how important parents are in knowing their children. So we must make sure that we have those conversations with parents, particularly parents with EAL. Did you want to say something? Sorry, you looked like you were going to say something then. Sorry, Isobel was I suppose we need to make sure that we understand if there is an additional language, what their first language is spoken at home, what their preferred language is. And as Isobel mentioned earlier, if we're having those conversations right from the time we first meet the children, when we induct them into our settings, we're setting up a kind of respectful conversation with parents. So hopefully it's not difficult to elicit that information.
Thank you. Moving on.
So we're moving up the pyramid now, and we're up to the last 2 layers here. And we can also compare the pyramid to an iceberg, so whizzing across the continents. So talking and speech sounds are what we can hear, which equates to the part of the iceberg that's above the water. So that's what we focus in on. What are we hearing? what are the children saying? But actually it's all of those skills that we can see on the pyramid that are under the water. It's an iceberg. They're the important ones.
And those are?
The looking and listening, the
Right.
play, the understanding, and the adult-child interaction.
So it's a recognition that there's the correct relationship between what is being said and actually what it's reflecting.
Yeah, don't focus in on the top bit.
Fine.
Focus in on the bottom bit first.
But often that's the first thing that parents and carers.
Yeah.
Well,
absolutely,
yes,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely. And the other thing to remember, apart from the 6 month gap between possibly between understanding and using language, children can also take a long time to process
Right.
language. So if we ask a child a question, it can take them up to 10 seconds quite easily to process what's been asked of them and to formulate the answer and to respond. But adults aren't very good at silence.
No.
So instead of waiting, we ask another question. And then we ask another question.
Or the same question.
Or the same
In a
question,
different
repeatedly.
way,
Yeah. And the child gets very confused because they haven't got a clue what they're supposed to be answering, and so they say nothing.
To what age is that
Well, it
delayed?
does reduce gradually over time, but I mean, even if I asked you if you've spoken to us and asked us questions this afternoon, and we've gone, and so we've taken time to think about what the correct response might be and to process. So even adults can sometimes take 3, 4, 5 seconds to formulate an answer, and we would give that to another adult. But we just assume that children are going to come back immediately with the answer. So
Yeah, it's a good point.
yeah, it's quite important that we remember that they do need that length of time sometimes, and it can be excruciating. 10 seconds is a very long time, and it can be 9.5 seconds before the child comes back. But if you just hang on in there, and it will be rewarded.
Makes you wonder, making sure that Ofsted inspectors appreciate that in terms of fluent dialogue.
Absolutely.
It could appear quite disjointed to an observer of the interaction, couldn't it? And I don't mean Ofsted inspectors per se, to somebody outside of what's going on.
Yeah, and I think generally speaking, we don't have enough periods of quiet. I know this sounds ridiculous when we're talking about speech, language and communication, but actually silence and quiet times are really important for language development. So include those times if you can.
Thank you.
And I think if we're thinking about confidence and sort of inspectors or any other adult coming in to a space where they think, where's the pace, where's the vigour in this conversation? It's really important that as the practitioners we're confident enough to then make a comment afterwards to say, did you notice there was some pausing here? That's because Charlie finds, if we give him some thought time.
No, that's thank you. Just looking down this, if you don't want to rush it, the hand rule?
The hand rule, yes. So the hand rule, if you look at your hand, this is about not asking too many questions. So we tend to ask, if you look at your hand, and what tends to happen is the fingers are usually the questions. So you ask 4 questions and maybe make 1 comment when you're talking to children. And this is actually turning that on its head and saying, in order to help children in the best possible way, if you ask 1 question, which is your thumb, and then you have 4 other things, so you might comment, you might expand on what they've said, so you might add an extra word on, you might repeat what they've said back to them, or you might sort of use some words to explain what they've said. So it's 4 of those to every question.
I'm going to put you on the spot now. Can you practice on me in that one? I should have prepared you for this, but just go on, try me.
Oh, so you want me to ask you something?
Yes.
So where's the spoon? It's in the cup.
Yes.
And it's not a spoon. It's
No,
a fork.
it's a fork. So there's a period of dialogue just from that one question. I see. Thank you.
I could have said the opposite of that would be, what's in that cup? Go on, pick it up, Michael. Can you pick up. Can you see what it is?
Yes, I see.
Maybe
It's a bombardment of questions rather.
Questions.
Fine,
Yeah.
thank you. That's really helpful.
Okay, so again, if we're thinking about the hand rule, following the child's lead will enable us to develop that vocabulary link, because they're interested, they're already playing with that cup, so they're going to want to have a look, Michael, as they're playing. So if we're just commenting on what they're doing, it's going to be far more memorable.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, coming up to our last slide now, speech sounds. We will be doing a whole session on speech sounds, but there are a lot of activities which you can use to support speech sound development. People tend to get quite anxious about children's speech as they get nearer to transitioning into school.
Right.
Are they going to be able to cope in school? Will they be able to be understood, etc.? And the important bit here for those children that you can be working on in the settings are the whole looking, listening and attention bricks, the blocks that we looked at earlier. They're of prime importance because you really do need children to be able to listen and to hear the difference between what they're saying and the adult version of those sounds. So we need to hone their listening skills. So anything you can do with your listening walks, etc., in preschool is really going to help. And
so are we on to the challenging issue of correcting?
Well, yeah, we'll cover that when we come to do speech sounds. But yes, don't correct, model the correct sounds.
Do you want to explain?
So in other words, if you're saying, oh, it's a boon, for the word spoon, if you call it a boon or a poon, don't say, no, it's not a boon, it's a spoon. Go on, say spoon, say spoon. Now put them together, say spoon, you hear it all the time. If you say to me boon, I say, yes, it's a spoon. So I'm slightly exaggerating the sound, but I'm repeating back the correct adult.
So you're agreeing with the recognition of the noun to the object, but actually you're just taking it a stage further by giving the correct one back without saying you got it wrong.
Yeah, because if you're constantly told you're not saying that right, you're not saying that right, you're not saying that, you're just going to give up saying anything, aren't you? Because you're bashed into the ground. So we will, as I said, cover speech sounds in a lot more detail in another webinar. So stammering, we've got stammering, stuttering, disfluency, all the same thing, all used to describe speech which is interrupted in some way. We all stammer, as I'm doing beautifully this afternoon, on occasions. The ums and the ers, they're all stammering to a certain extent. Children will repeat either the first sound in a word, like ball, or they might repeat the whole word, like ball, 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 boy. It can be a typical stage of language development. Quite a lot of children will naturally go through this stage, but sometimes it is the precursor to what's going to be an ongoing issue. Most of the time it depends on the impact on the child. Is the child bothered by the fact that they're doing that? Or the impact because the parent's anxious. So if the parent's really anxious, then it's always worth trying to refer those children to speech and language therapy, where they'll get the correct advice, because we don't want those primary stammers to actually develop into anything more serious.
Are there any indicators of the types of disfluency or stuttering that are signs of possible? I'm thinking particularly of particular phonemes, per or per.
No, not really.
There's no association.
No, and they can come on overnight and be really bad, but that is no indicator of the fact that that's going to be a lifelong stammer. They could just develop very gradually and be very slight, and that's actually going to go on forever. So there's no correlation at all.
Thank you.
It needs to be, it needs specialist advice with those sorts of things. Selective mutism is a little bit of a bugbear with me. Everybody seems to be using the phrase selective mutism when a child isn't particularly vocal, and they might just be shy. And the more pressure we put on the children,
The shyer they're
going to get. But that's not selective mutism. Selective mutism is actually a psychiatric diagnosis.
So are we rushing to medicalise
We
this?
are, yeah. It's like a few years ago, everybody talked about autism all the time, and
Still
actually
do.
they do. And some children maybe just doing some quite typical development stuff, lining cars up or something, and that child must be autistic then. And giving those labels out to parents, be very, very careful. It's really only consultants who can diagnose.
And I think, again, that point we were talking earlier on in terms of the confidence of the practitioners to be able to have that conversation with the parent who is anxious about a child being quiet, that actually let's not set any hairs running in terms of a possible medical condition.
Absolutely have the conversation about shyness and quiet.
Yeah, or we've not noticed. When Charlie's here, we've noticed this.
Right.
Have you, can you share what Charlie's like at home? And then sometimes I say, they line up their toys and they talk about everything that's happened their day. They become you. So actually, is there a concern there?
Right.
It's more to do with maybe the anxiety that the individual child has when they're in our environments. It's strange. It's noisy. It can be overwhelming. So we have to bear that in mind too.
Thank you. Right, moving on, just towards the end, just some further information for those people who want to pursue this fascinating topic further. Some links that you can take off the screen. As I said, these slides will be available and circulated to those people who've registered and attended. And also, as it says at the bottom, we are developing a resource pack which will be made available to those people who have attended these sessions. And the aim of those is to reinforce your own understanding, but also to hopefully hold in-service training sessions with your staff in the nursery, in the preschool, to start teasing out what this means for your practice in your setting. So I hope you found that of value. It's my thanks to both Sian and Isobel for the expert input. I found this subject absolutely fascinating. It will be part of the series, as I've mentioned throughout today's session, and the next one we will be running is in March, which leads me neatly on to say that you don't miss out for a webinar in February, but we're changing tack considerably to a session on plastic not so fantastic. It will be in February, and that date will be confirmed, but will be made available through our usual social media channels. And as it says there, the next of these sessions will be on March 27th, and we hope you can join us. My thanks to you all once again for attending today.